My name is Matthew Duffy, and I'm a I'm a student in the Resilient Leadership Master's Program at Naropa University, and this is my case study presentation for ecological justice. Um, and yeah, I'm guessing that this might just be Janine watching this, but any of the other students, if you watch this, miss you guys. I hope everyone's well during these times. And it was an honor being in this course with you all. I chose this case study because I grew up a little bit in Panama for like 2.5 years, I think. These early years, as they are kind of blurry, but I think from ages like two or so to about five, I was in Panama, stationed there with my family on Howard Air Force Base, which is in the Canal Zone. And my father, he was in the army, and he was a helicopter pilot, and he was essentially tasked with um, coordinating missions between the Panamanian, Colombian, Nicaraguan, and U.S. government to fight narcos. Um, he was involved in missions that were part of Iran Contra, which was flying massive amounts of assault weapons to um, basically supply guerrilla warfare against narcos. And they would, you know, I only know the little bits he's told me pretty much, but they would fly over the missions they would go on would be helicopter missions over cocaine cocaine plantations uh, and I don't know, like strongholds, and they would just dump glyphosate over swaths of the rainforest and where these little strongholds were located. Um, so yeah, that's some of my karma. That's just a tip of the whole berg. Um, and then I went back to Panama when I was 23 to intern at a very strange, complicated enterprise called Kaluyala. So I ended up working there as an agriculture director and teaching permaculture for 2.5 years or so after college, and left, kind of left with a trail of fire, metaphorically, behind me. Yeah, I'll just say that there's pretty much a revolution. It was like the rise and fall of like a tiny village civilization, awakening to colonization and just a lot of the messed up stuff that was going on at this place that marketed itself as an ecological institution, and had a lot of beautiful, cool things that I was doing, but ultimately it was BS. So I did my best to compost that on my way out. And so now I'm back in looking at Panama, and this case study gave me this opportunity to kind of transport myself back there and go deeper into this place that is just like entangled in me. It's part of it's part of who I am. It's part of my story, and I love Panama, and it's like really emotional. Honestly, I had an emotional cascade of and like an unfolding that's been really beautiful, not nasty, but also like just pain and like feeling heat in my heart as I studied this history and pieced together this case study. So now that's just a little bit of context, just my stuff. Um, Try to get us in that personal space because the personal is political. Um, so yeah, I'll just begin. I'll I'll do a brief, some non-linear yet linear, hopefully coherent breakdown of how the Panama Canal unfolding began and where it is currently situated in that situation. So, the Panama Canal project goes way back to 1881 with a French attempt that lasted about 8 years. Um, and that was a horrible failure. Beyond a failure, it was a catastrophe, and just it's incredible how many people died trying to build this canal. 23,000 people estimated lost their lives, and in the span of that project, that would be about 40 people a day. Most of those workers who died, most of those deaths were Afro Caribbean and Indian workers that were shipped in for the project. The main cause of death that I saw in that initial attempt was disease, but a lot the way that they were trying to do it were just like digging and sludging through land over and over again, and then giant mudslides would happen and just bury people. So that whole region of the canal is just a massive graveyard, really. And that was just the first attempt. Um, then the US came along with old Teddy Roosevelt, who is often lionized as one of the greatest environmentalist presidents of all time. People may know he was buddies with John Muir, and yeah, just came up with that whole crew of romantic conservationists who were ultimately, just conservationists, just very utilitarian. Still felt totally okay with dominating nature and having that sort of relationship with the earth. So old Teddy, he led from the U.S. perspective. I mean, the everything I read about his role in this is actually, pretty. Not to say it's good. It's just incredible how bullheaded and just like cavalier this person was. He just would not stop. And yeah, I'll come back to Teddy and his role in it a little bit, but in the U.S. Project, which was it began in 1904 and ended in 1914. The death toll is estimated at 5,500. I got a number 5,609. I don't know. It's probably more. It usually always is. With over 80% of those deaths being black and brown folks. And the project this time, under the U.S. guidance, heavy artillery, of course, used a lot of dynamite. So they just blew up mountains and entire ecosystems, completely displaced folks who lived in towns, made them leave, just go. I couldn't find anything about any sort of support in that either. It was pretty much just like the worst sort of draconian, what's it called? I can't remember when government seized land from folks. Um, and yeah, it towns, ecosystems just completely removed, and it's considered now a man-made wonder of the world. And it made an absolutely devastating impact on our planet and our humanity. It like this way I see it kind of changed our DNA. Um, and there's a quote in that regard from a man named James Bryce, who was the British ambassador to the U.S. from 1907 to 1913, called the Panama Canal the greatest liberty ever taken with nature. I would say against. And so then Teddy, let's get back to Teddy. He said that the construction of the Panama Canal was essential for America to play a dominant role in global trade. So hear that language. That's what this was all about, of course. Although the way that it was enacted was through this guise of like liberating and helping Panama. We're gonna help these poor primitive folks step into the first world, essentially. Um, so yeah, the U.S. was not in that administration not just committed to the development of the canal, but to ensure U.S. sovereignty of the canal, and this is how it went down. And this is how the Office of the Historian, which is part of the Department of State, tells it. So President Roosevelt oversaw the realization of a long-term United States goal, a trans-Isthmian canal. Following heated debate over the location of the proposed canal on June 19, 1902, the U.S. Senate voted in favor of building the canal through Panama. Within 6 months, Secretary of State John Hay signed a treaty with the Colombian Foreign Minister Tomas Herron to build the new canal. So people might not know, but Panama was a part of Colombia up until this point. The financial terms were unacceptable to Colombia's Congress, and so they rejected the offer, but President Roosevelt wasn't having it. So he dispatched U.S. warships to Panama City and Colón to support Panamanian independence. Colombian troops, they didn't stand a chance. So shortly after that coup, the U.S. crafted a treaty giving the U.S. control over the canal and negotiated it without a single Panamanian present. That's true. Not one Panamanian was there. Then, when Panamanians began to revolt against that absolute injustice, it's just blatant stealing, the administration then deployed 2,000 Marines and a fleet of warships, and they forced a surrender. So, a whole lot of trickery, and as we might know, if we know U.S. history, real people's history, that's always been the MO. So that resulted in a nullification of Panama's sovereignty for 90 years, and honestly, they're still largely controlled by international corporate influence, and there's a lot of corruption there. So, pause. Took a break. Now I'm back. No hat. Skull tan. So we left off with Panama still being, there's a lot of corruption there and corporate influence there. Still to this day, the U.S. government maintains a sort of air of glory as the canal being a U.S. triumph and this huge feat for globalization and U.S. interest. In reality, the actual workforce was a global effort in coordinating it. But for the most part, the labor came from the Caribbean, mostly Afro-Caribbean folks. Roughly 150,000 to 200,000 people from the Caribbean migrated to Panama just to build the canal. Black and brown workers particularly faced hellish working conditions and very racist policies I'll get into later. But once one of those policies, for instance, was workers could be jailed or deported if they didn't show up for work or were late. So it was very, just horrifically fascist and racist. So the Panamanian contribution of actual Panamanian folks and the devastation of Panama is pretty much always overlooked in popular history of the canal. Like I said earlier, entire towns were destroyed to make way for the canal. Indigenous peoples and lands were also displaced and decimated. And since its birth as a nation, Panama, which again was born for this project, it's become this hub of world trade. So all these ships and interest and vectors of power placing roots, settling, colonizing in this place has completely altered the ethnic and biological makeup of the region. It's terraformed the nation. Panama was a land bridge, and then that was gutted to make canal. Um, so yeah, since Panama has maintains a strange, complicated, and ambiguous identity, um, formed through a lifetime of arrested development. So the Panama Canal Zone. So the what it's more than just a strip. Um, there's a whole aerial like radius that's 48 miles long, with 5 miles along each side of the canal, that the U.S. exercised complete sovereignty over to develop and control the canal. The Canal Zone officially opened in 1904. When that happened, thousands and thousands of Americans moved to that place as like this, almost like it was like Puerto Rico or Hawaii, um, and built this sort of white paradise, called themselves Zonians, and it's been noted, and I would say that in my experience that this is somewhat true from what I've seen. Although the zone these days is the Air Force Base is gone, and there's a lot of different folks there, but it tends to be an elite. It's its own culture, just the zone, and it's a very elitist culture. Um, they call themselves Zonians, and they exhibited a level of nationalism that seemed to surpass that of their compatriots back home in the States. So the Canal Zone was governed by a rigid racial caste system marked by what was called the gold roll and the silver roll, with white folks, and it was completely blatantly racially designed. So if you were white, you were on the gold roll. If you were black or brown, you were on the silver roll. And this determined everything. Everything was doled out in this sort of socialist, fascist way. Salary, housing, furnishing, work risk, and treatment was racially designed into the system. Black and brown workers were given appalling food rations and accommodations, if any at all, with many men often living in converted boxcars on the outskirts of the zone, and families being forced to fend for themselves in Panama City, Cologne, and in rainforest dwellings. Those harsh living conditions were coupled with extremely dangerous working conditions that were also disparately placed upon the black and brown population, with black and brown workers being 4 times more likely to die on the job than white workers. To actually build the canal, engineers dammed the Chagres River, which is a beautiful, massive river that goes through the Darien. It goes up into Colombia, and they dammed it to flood this huge expanse of central Panama. 164 square miles of rainforest, town, and village were flooded. For comparison, Denver is smaller than that. Denver's 155 square miles. The Culebra Mountains were dynamited and cut through to make a passage to the Pacific, as the development of the canal displaced many and summoned massive international immigration. The damage to biodiversity, deforestation, and depletion of clean water sources continues to impact and push out impoverished and indigenous communities. So by American design, U.S. design, there was little to no economic benefit or access at all for Panamanians within the zone. They were essentially barred. And so all of these U.S. immigrants who moved to the zone, they like to call themselves expats instead of immigrants. And that's actually a common thing around the world. Panama, old white Zonians, and people who moved in other places in Panama, they still call themselves expats because I guess there's a connotation with immigrant that they don't like. They really, wanted to make this like a white paradise suburbia. So in cooperation culturally and through enforcement with the U.S. military there, Panamanians were prohibited from working on the canal, working in the canal zone. Businesses could not provide services to the canal zone, Panamanian businesses, or to the ships passing through. So technically they were allowed inside, but their presence was heavily discouraged, violently discouraged, by the canal zone authorities. Panamanian residents couldn't cross their own country at times without having to answer to foreign police. By the 1950s, tensions had reached a point where authorities agreed to build a wall along the border between Panama City and the canal zone. The wall did not fully limit access to the zone, rather, it further stoked hostilities. In 1964, a group of students at Panama's Instituto Nacional marched into the canal zone and insisted on raising Panama's flag above Balboa High School. Authorities responded by tear gassing the crowd and then some. In the violence that ensued, 28 people were killed. Most of them were Panamanian. It took until 1999 for the U.S. to hand the canal over to Panama. Before that, though, tensions between the U.S. and Panama came to a head not too long before my family and I moved there, when Manuel Noriega, who is still in prison in Panama, he was accused by the U.S. of not abiding by democratic procedure in Panama. Noriega's stance was that, so he was president. He was a populist. He was loved by many, hated by many. He used to be really great friends with Bush and Reagan. He was trained in the CIA. But Bush did not like when he started to move towards being more in alignment with the proletariat. And also he had relations with Escobar, and this might be misspeaking, but no, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. So Noriega refused to step down because he felt that the election was rigged. And then the U.S. government invaded Panama for a period of about a month from the end of 1989 to 1990. And that invasion, which no one really ever talks about, 3,500 Panamanians were killed in that invasion. And Panama City was in ruins. And I can remember as a child driving through and around the city, and it was just like rubble. I just remember seeing, everything was just crumbling. So that was a slaughter. That was a massacre. Since the canal was handed over to Panama in 1999, indigenous communities and peasant unions led a movement into a struggle against the expansion of the canal, so the Panamanian government wanted to make the canal much larger. The major organization behind that resistance was called the Peasant Network Against Dams. That's the English translation. It was formed to protect the canal watersheds. Many direct actions and protests pushed the Panamanian government to concede to setting more strict limits for the canal watershed, implementing water recycling technology, and ensuring a countrywide referendum that would decide on the canal's expansion. So there was a big resistance that began in 2006, and it was a very hot fight. But ultimately, the expansion project was passed. The proposal was passed, and the project was completed in 2016. The Panamanian National Environmental Authority stated that the canal and urban sprawl around it is causing watershed damage, erosion, and tainted water supply to Panama City and the surrounding area. Go figure. And then you can come in. Hey, Janine, this is Gracie. You might know. I don't know if you know we're partners.
She does not. Me.
She does know?
Yeah. Well, she knows me.
Oh, well, I'm glad you guys know each other. Sweet people. And then Mm, so yeah, to start to wrap this up about the state of Panama around this, which I don't really claim to know at all, just lived experience and through research. Um, there is a interdependent co-arising, as they say, of trajectories. Um, so there's still global investment pouring into the region. The canal is kind of rendering itself obsolete as ship trade is just not really the the way to go, I guess, right now with transport. I think most thing is shipped through air. Um, but still, because it's this bridge of the Americas and the milieu that's already in place, it's this hotbed for, um, resort building and tourist industry and colonization, corporate colonization from all angles. So there will likely be um, further displacement, potentially in ethnocide and ecocide. Although some of the indigenous groups in Panama, um, they're incredibly resilient. The Guna folks have maintained their sovereignty in the San Blas archipelago, and there are many indigenous folks who live within the Darien region, which is one of the most dangerous places in the world for because of the drug trafficking that goes through there. Um, but yeah, praying for them. And also, there's a real large surge of permaculture movements and localized economies and cooperatives, and that's been increasing through Panama for the past 10 to 20 years. There's a lot of good local um, sovereignty and agency being built through that. Um, there's also a lot of Bill Mollison type permies who are coming that are kind of like frontiersmen who want to um, start eco villages and things like that, sort of like the place that I was working at. And so there's a lot of nuance and complexity there. Um, all that said, given the super complex intersection of interest and influence in Panama, the intersection of possibilities provides a future for Panama that is as complex as its past. As much as it is possible that Panama continues on as a primary channel for the spread of capitalist empire, it is equally possible that Panama becomes a critical vector for the composting of globalization and capitalism. Perhaps these possibilities are not mutually exclusive. I would reckon they're not. Um, yeah, Panama is a very dynamic place. It's growing a lot. This When I lived there, there was a Trump Tower. It's recently been um, replaced with something else. Um, but the expansion that I saw just in a few years that was happening on coastlines and um, it was rated by NPR or something like the happiest country in the world. So it's just become a very um, attractive place for folks who, you know, want to carve their way, charge their way to the life that they feel like they deserve. Thank you for joining me on this journey back in time to now. I hope that this has provided some felt, heartfelt connection to Panama. It's What's happened in Panama is something that if you live in America, it's definitely something that we're deeply connected to. Um, yeah, it's that intersection of the two Americas now that they are seen as split. And I think I want to just end this with a prayer for Panama. So I'm just gonna slam it. Um, May the people of Panama and the land called Panama know liberation. May Panama come to experience, witness, and invoke a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, not that negative peace, which is the absence of tension. May the unavoidable reckoning and reclamation that surely will ensue in Panama be transformative and restorative and liberating. And may the land that was sliced and carved open by the building of the canal feel our love and our sorrow and our grief. And may that canal and all that's happened there become a channel for global liberation. Thank you. I'll bow. Peace and blessings.